so delighted to be here for this ninth conclave. I look out in the audience and I see many old friends and some folks whom I hope will become new friends. It's very good for me to be here. I want to begin by acknowledging that we sit in the space of a congregation which has been doing this work for more than a century. What is now the Community Church of New York, then led by John Haynes Holmes, began reaching out to the community of color and welcoming them into its doors in the early part of the 20th century. It has been more than a century that this congregation has been living a significantly, at least biracial and now multicultural life. And so for those who ask me whether it is possible for a Unitarian Universalist church to live in a multicultural way, I point to congregations like this one and a few others who were intentional, that's a critical word, about their decision to reach out and to welcome those who were yearning for a liberal religious home, even if they did not fit the then predominant demographic of the congregation. So I want to thank Community Church for all that you have done, Bruce, and everyone else who is here. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. Hope gave me the task of giving an assessment of where Unitarian Universalism is in our attempt to transform ourselves into an anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and multicultural faith. Wow. Wow. Where are we? Well, it's a complicated question to even begin to know how to address. Because the reality, even though in this space, with this crowd, there is tremendous consistency of commitment, the reality is that Unitarian Universalism, as a larger family of faith, is all over the place. All over the place. With good news and bad news in abundance, both. But there are some real signs of hope that I will get to in a few minutes. There are signs of hope for what we can do together. One of the questions that we have to ask ourselves as we talk about the transformation into, and I can use the shorthand here, ARDC. You're all with that stuff at school. One of the questions is, well, I guess there are two. One, what would it mean if we got there? I mean, what would it look like if we got there? And secondly, and importantly, how would we measure our progress? Would we measure it by the number of darker faces in our congregational worship every Sunday? Is that how we would measure it? Is that what we mean when we say we're going to transform into an ARDC faith? Well, we've actually never been willing to go there, to name that as the objective. We've been unwilling to say that our congregation should go out and acquire a few more dark faces so that the white folks there would feel better about themselves. It hasn't felt like a spiritually grounded approach. Would we measure it by the number of anti-racism and diversity committees that we have? Is that a good measure of well, you know, it's a sign of engagement, but measuring by numbers of committees really does not feel good, at least from where I sit. Would be measured by the number of resolutions that we have passed. Would that be a good measure of our transformation? Well, I have to tell you that resolutions are important. They're stakes in the ground. But somehow, counting up the number of resolutions and feeling good about ourselves as a result also does not feel like a very grounded way to measure our success. So I'm of the opinion that one of the best measures that we can have, the most authentic measures that we can have, is engagement. To what extent are our congregations engaged engage in some way with this business of transforming themselves and engaging with issues of race and culture. And that can take the form of committees. Absolutely. It can take the form of resolutions passed by the congregation's board. It can even, and as I said, we weren't willing to go there, it can even take the form of noticing who's present for worship and religious education. That too can be a measure. But ultimately, of course, this transformation is a transformation of the heart. It's not a transformation of the committee structure or a resolution or even who's in worship on Sunday morning. It's a transformation of the heart. And that is something which can only be measured by heart measures. By heart measures. One of the things, corollaries of all of this, and our unwillingness to name the way we will measure our progress, is that we have tended far too much to be an ahistorical faith community. We don't remember, even things that happened 10 years ago are hard for us to hold in memory, and going back as far as the beginning of the last century as this congregation does, that's virtually impossible for us to hold. Right now, there's a manuscript sitting on my desk. It's called The Journey from Calgary General Assembly in 1992. Were any of you there besides me? Quite a few. That was where the first racial and cultural diversity resolution was passed. It was an attempt to re-engage with the issue of race on the part of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations when we had been out of the game for some two decades. And three courageous individuals, including Leslie Takahashi Morris, Chip Rauch, and Leon Spencer, agreed to take on the task of trying to tell the story of the Unitarian Universalist engagement with issues of race and transformation since 1992. And I want to thank Leslie in public for being willing to take it on. It was a daunting task. You see, one of the other ways that we can measure our progress is by the narrative that we tell about ourselves. It's about our story and creating a story. And there are some changes needed in the Unitarian Universalist story, at least as it's told in most of our congregation. A lot of people, especially in my generation, and I'm an old guy now, tell the story of our engagement with race centering on Selma, Alabama in 1965. And it's a story, it's a triumphal story. It's a story about Dr. King's call for white clergy to come to Selma and to stand with him, and how, well, I have to tell you that every Unitarian minister who was alive and serving them claims to have gone to Selma. I've not met anyone who was serving them who doesn't claim it. In any event, it was quite clear that the Unitarian presence was the largest presence of clergy from another denomination present there. And it was a moment that we, pride's a tricky emotion religiously. But it is a moment that we can take pride in. We honor it in the chapel at 25 Beacon Street, this large bronze memorial. But somehow, a narrative which centers on a moment of triumph for us does not seem to be an adequate narrative of Unitarian Universalist engagement with issues of race and culture. To a certain extent, this is generational. I know you all watched the drama of Reverend Wright and Barack Obama and the way the whole issue was treated by the press, but I was actually able quite easily to relate to Reverend Wright, because it is a generational thing. The story that he told was the story that my generation grew up with. It was an angry story, a very angry story, and he gave voice to that anger. He gave voice to that anger, but the story that's being told now by youth and young adults, is a very different story. It still has elements of anger, and there is certainly pain still a part of it. But it's not a black and white story. The story that's being told now is a story that, well, I'll give you an example. My son, who's a young adult, you know, when you ask him what race he is, and he comes out of a mixed race marriage, he wants to tell you the whole story. He said, you know, my mother's Scotch and Irish and English, and my dad is Scotch and Irish and English and African, and that's who I am. And for you to know me, you have to know all of me. You're not going to, my daughter, who's a young adult now, will, when she's confronted with the census form, not check African American as I do still, it's just a matter of habit. You know, she wants to check all of the boxes that apply. and do you know that the census is seriously considering stopping asking racial identity on the form? Because the list has gotten so long. It's a different story that's being told today. A different story. Throughout Unitarian Universalist work, at least in this generation, in the last since Calvary, one of the things that I am most mindful of is the danger of fundamentalism. The danger of fundamentalism. Now we know theologically that fundamentalism is dangerous for Unitarian Universalists. These are all of the conversations about whether humanism is the right Unitarian Universalist path, a more spiritual path is the right. They're dangerous because they work to exclude people. And at our heart, Unitarian Universalism is about making a circle big enough for everyone to come into. But I would argue that fundamentalism in our approach to the transformation into an anti-racist, anti-aggressive, multicultural, that fundamentalism in that area is also highly dangerous. I can remember not too long ago, where there was a huge fight between those who thought that you needed the correct analysis of racism to move forward, and there was only one correct analysis. And those who felt that you didn't begin with analysis, you began with personal story. This was Conclave, among others, who claimed that anti-racism was never. And it was a huge fight, as if it was necessary to have a party-authorized approach which was going to get us there. When in reality, that's not how Unitarian Universalism works. Unitarian Universalism works, I'll use the metaphor from Forrest Church, who says that it's like having a cathedral with many windows, and you can look in through any one of them, and see, or at least glimpse, the holy. I think it's the same way with work on race. That it really doesn't matter where you begin. You can begin with analysis. You can begin with personal story. You can begin with engagement with the. It doesn't matter where you begin, because inevitably, if you begin, you'll bump up against the need for all of those things as you do the work. So fundamentalism is very dangerous for us. So, to the question that I was asked, where are we in the transformation? I think we're in a period of openness to it in our congregations, and I hope and pray that I am not merely being optimistic. But I believe that we're in a period of openness. I'm going to say a few things about this, kind of come at it from different ways. I want to say a little bit about my presidency of the UUA. You know, when I was elected, there was this big media to-do, first black president, traditionally white denomination, all of that, and some people, and again, pride's tricky. Some people said, well, you know, we've pretty well done our work, right? There he is. Let's give ourselves a The reality was that Unitarian Universalism was stuck at that point. Stuck. The approaches that the association had tried from Boston had generated such tremendous pushback that the vast majority of our ministers, and therefore our congregations, simply were not open to engagement. They were not, we were stuck in a big time way. And we had a paucity of resources to offer. You know, there were just a few. There was a very successful, what's called Jubilee 1, which I bet everybody in this room has been through at least once. There was what we now call the Jubilee 2, which was the official Crossroads, top-down, reactivity producing model. I bet everybody here has been through Jubilee 2 as well. There were some curricular resources, Weaving the Fabric of Diversity, and a few others. But that's about as far as it went. That's about as far as it went. And so I made the decision for a variety of reasons not to make race an important part of my first term in terms of my prophetic voice. Both because we didn't have the resources to allow us to make a transition, and also, frankly, because I feared that my presidency would be compromised. That I would be, oh, he's a black president, you know, of course he's going to say that. We made a very difficult transition out of that stuck place at the association. A very difficult transition in personnel, in the development of resources, the development of new imagination, the creation of the Just Change Consultancy Program. There must be Just Change Consultants here. Or anybody, is anyone here a Just Change Consultant?
Denise Reed Johnson.
Oh, can't see him back. Yes, hi. Which the Just Change program tries to take congregations where they are and build on their success. So if they've had success with work on BGLT issues, it honors that. It says, all right, so what have you learned? How can that be applied? It tries to build on success rather than taking a negative attitude. In my second term, I've been raising my voice much more clearly, I hope, calling for our association to engage in a version of the Truth and Reconciliation process, which was imagined in South Africa, where I'll be going in the fall, by the way. Imagined in South Africa, which recognizes that you have to be able to know your story, know your history, and be honest about it. And then ask yourself, with whom do you need to be reconciled as a result? Many of our congregations have engaged, at least a few. The work there has been enormously helped by the Reverend David Petit, who has been exploring his personal, we have a relative, David's here, his own personal family story, and the fact that his ancestors were significant slave traders. And so we've been significantly helped by that. Traces of the Trade is another important contribution in that. And that feels very, very good and productive to me. There are some hopeful signs that lead me to believe that there is an openness in Unitarian Universalism. First, there is the whole concept of allyship, which has emerged actually quite recently. And I'm thinking of Allies for Racial Equity, the national UU organization, which I commend to you as showing real signs of health and beginning to ask questions about what does it mean to be a white ally in this group? What does that look like, and who gets to name an ally? You know, there are a lot of questions that come up if you actually delve into that. There's the shift to at least a conversation about multiculturalism. You know, racial and cultural diversity resolution was passed, multiculturalism wasn't on anybody's screen. It was really a black-white paradigm, and the trainings reflected that. And so we're at least beginning to think about and talk about what multiculturalism would look like. And I have to acknowledge that in these times, in this day and age, as you walk the streets of New York or any other city, it does not take a PhD to know that we live in a multicultural world. But back then, back in 1992, back then we hadn't gotten it. We simply hadn't gotten it. So that's a good thing. And it's raising all kinds of questions for us. As we begin to think multiculturally and begin to use the songs and the writings from other cultures and some of the artifacts, you begin asking your question, well, who gave you the right to use that song? I mean, that's the song from mine. So it's a question of cultural appropriation or cultural misappropriation. Our musicians, by the way, are taking that question very seriously and doing, I think, some excellent work in terms of what you need to do when you use a worship resource from another culture. What kind of story do you need to tell about what it means that you're using? I think it's very, very helpful. I travel around a lot, another sign of hopefulness, even though it's not dramatic. When I travel, I am seeing and meeting a few more people of color in our congregations than I did 10 years ago. Now, I don't know why this is happening. I have hopes, but I don't know why. But it's undoubtedly true. And as I meet with religious education classes in our congregations, the reality of a multicultural world is there. It may be in the downstairs church, but it's in the church. And we have some significant responsibilities there in terms of the kind of church that we lead to all of our children. Another hopeful sign, the number of congregations that are involved with congregationally based community organizing. And how many of your congregations are doing that at all? A couple here. There are more than 100 nationwide. And it brings our folks into contact with poor communities. And poor communities are almost always, not always, but almost communities of color. And I think it's a very good spiritual discipline for us. Some of our congregations are actually starting to be intentional about outreach in a multicultural world. So, first, San Diego, one of our large congregations, is planting a satellite congregation down on the Mexican border in an area which is almost exclusively Latina and Latino. And the leadership of that congregation is drawn primarily from Latina and Latino folks from First San Diego. It's a bold experiment, and we'll learn a lot. But this is new territory for us. New territory for us, bringing the good news of Unitarian Universalism to that community in a way that we have not. So there are lots of signs that I view as hopeful signs. Right now, my work at the national level is designed to try to find those few points of leverage where we can move toward a tipping point. And the primary one we call the Diversity of Ministry Initiative. We right now are blessed with more than 50 recently fellowshipped ministers of color and seminarians of color who are called to our ministry. If you were to take our experience of the last 20 or 30 years, I could confidently predict that half of those persons will not be Unitarian Universalists in 10 years. Our track record of supporting ministries by ministers of color is abysmal. And so the Diversity of Ministry Program Initiative attempts to invite particular congregations that have a particular calling into a process where we work with them very intensely to prepare them to receive the ministry of these ministers of color. I can give you all sorts of specific information. Is Sophia Betancourt here someplace yet? No, Sophia is the primary staff person on this. She's a very valuable resource. But the short version is it's giving some capacity to the congregational, and not just the congregational leaders, but going as deep in the congregation as possible, and providing them some capacity so that they can keep the issue of race on top of the table rather than it going underground, where it will almost surely undermine the ministry. Almost surely. We had 2 negotiated settlements just this year of ministers of color who, where the conversation went underground. And before you know it, they were in negotiation to leave the congregation. So that's really, and we work just as intentionally with the seminarians and new ministers of color to prepare them to minister in our congregations as they are today, not some ideal congregations that may be created in the future. It's very hopeful, I think. I'm going to run a little bit long. I had, all right, you're getting it. My hope is that we can create a tipping point. That when there is not one minister of color in a UUMA chapter, but 2 or 3 or 4, that the conversation among our ministers will change. My hope is that when there are successful ministries that other people can see down the road in the next town, that the conversation will change and shift. This is an article of faith, and I hope, I pray that I am right. I want to talk about 2 spiritual challenges that I think we face. The first has to do with the concept of white privilege. You all know about this concept, I know. White privilege. It has been talked about often as a sense of entitlement. And I'm not sure that we have an adequate vocabulary or spiritual approach to this issue widely spread among us. Because for me, it would be very, if I were white, I think it would be very difficult to get to a real sort of gut belief in white privilege. If I had the attitude that everything that I have, everything that I'm entitled to, I worked hard for it, I worked hard all my life, and so I'm entitled to everything that I've got. I think we need to start at a different spiritual place. And that place is what I call the language of reverence. If you can't, as a human being, begin every day with thankfulness for all that you have been given. Thankfulness. We didn't create this planet, this world. We didn't create these resources that we're using so wastefully. You didn't create this church building. We have been given so much. If you can't start with thankfulness, I don't see how you can get to a recognition that you are privileged. Now, I try to do that in my life, not around race, but my issue for many, many years has been around gender. And I try to get there, but I think you have to start with that spiritual place which begins with thankfulness for all that we've been given, rather than with justification or entitlement for all that we have. So this is a cutting edge piece of language for me that I want to share. Second spiritual challenge. We are talking for most of our congregations about significant congregational culture change. And that is very difficult to achieve. Let me give you few thoughts on that. One is very broad. Most of our congregations, and there's actually solid describe themselves as friendly. Friendly. That happens, by the way, to be the most predicted measure of congregational decline, when congregations describe themselves as friendly. What it means is that within the small gathered community, they're friends, right? It's like family, really. It's an extended family. We love each other. We like to get potlucks for free. We need to change that culture to a culture of welcoming. A culture of welcoming where we understand that we are called to welcome those. Imagine what courage it takes for someone who knows no one in the congregation to get up on Sunday morning, particularly for a person of color, and walk into a congregation that's 99 to 100% white, and be asked to send your children downstairs away from you. This is no small thing. It's no small thing. And so we need to cultivate a spiritual habit of truly welcoming the other and understanding that there's a need which is bringing those folks into our congregation's doors. The second thing that I want to point to is that, and this is changing in most of our congregations, our music is shifting, beginning to shift. There are more rhythms and harmonies being sung, and even maybe one more language. We've moved beyond some of us having only de colores as the only Spanish that we allow in our congregations. The shift needs to accelerate. But what I know is that when a person of color walks into one of our congregations, they need to see some sign, some symbol that they are welcome. It can be in the music, it can be in a declaration on the wall, it can be a poster, some sign that they're not in a completely alien world. Now this is not rocket science, but very few of our congregations do it. The third thing that we have to give up, is a demographic determinism, which I think has limited us severely. We, almost all of us, including me, describe ourselves as a predominantly white denomination. Now, that's true. It's true. It's accurate. It's not helpful. It's not helpful. With a theology as embracing as ours, we need to find better language to describe who we are on this issue. And I encourage people to go to the language of welcome, of who we welcome, of all the people that we welcome, rather than reinforcing who we have allowed ourselves to become. So, I'm going to wrap this up. I wish I could talk for another 45 minutes. I could easily. So where are we? I think we are in a period of openness. I think there has been enough of a shift so that there's openness, if not readiness, on the part of many of our congregations to engage. And remember, I think engagement is the most important measure of success. What we need at this point, in that environment of openness, is leadership. Leadership is critical. It was critical in the transformation of this congregation by John Haynes Holmes. It was critical in the leadership of All Souls in Washington, D.C., under David Eaton, whom Bruce mentioned, and the ministers who prepared for him. Leadership, and so I am delighted that this is an all-high turnout here, because this is a leadership group that can help us make the transformation. It's been a pleasure